Hello and welcome again to another ConsenSys Cypherpunk Hackathon workshop. Today we have Evan doing an amazing and much needed workshop on avoiding Web3 silos in regards to identity. So just a quick Crowdcast housekeeping. This is the platform we're using today. On the right-hand side, as I'm sure you're familiar, we have a chat that is ongoing throughout the workshop. So feel free to use that. We also would love you to queue any questions you have for Evan today in the Ask a Question queue at the bottom there. If you write a question in the chat and you put the question mark before you hit enter, you'll notice a little orange button pops up and it says, would you like to add this to the queue? The advantage of putting it into the queue is that we'll see when you have a question that I can ask Evan to answer. And you also have the opportunity, if you like, to come up on screen and ask the question yourself. That's great. And you can interact with Evan as well. But then we also can know to prioritize questions and make sure we're getting all those questions answered and we don't miss it in the chat. Also, throughout, if you have questions, we'll try to get those and address those as they come up. However, if they're missed, we'll always leave time at the very end to answer any questions that are still in the queue. There's also a shiny green button at the bottom there. It says see more workshops and sign up for the hackathon. I know we're getting close, but there's still more workshops to check out. And of course, if you're interested in actually hacking in the hackathon itself, June 7th through 11th, there's a sign-up form there for you to let us know your interest level, whether it's you have an idea and you want to hack on that idea and you need a team that we can help you get that team together, or maybe you're just interested in hopping into a project and you want to know what kind of ideas need teammates. So we'll help align you guys with that. And we have some team building sessions that you can join throughout this week and next week if you check out the calendar. So I'm Shay. Without further ado, I'll hand the microphone over to Evan.
Shay, thank you so much. And thank you, fellow Meshians, for joining us here today. I'm so excited and appreciative to have this opportunity to speak with you all. So as Shay mentioned, my name is Evan, and I work closely with the Serto team. You may know some of the foundations of our work from a former team called Uport as well. So at Serto, we enable Web3 and the Ethereum ecosystem by making it really easy to get started with decentralized identity. And so the theme of today's conversation is that we want to make sure we don't forget to decentralize the identity layer like we decentralize the protocol layer, because otherwise we're building a silo in Web3. So to expect today, I will be providing an introduction kind of overall to identity. What is identity? Why is that important to us in the Web3 space? And then I'll introduce some of our favorite crypto primitives, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. And then I'll provide you with some quick steps to get started on your own. So first, I'm going to encourage us to think about what is identity really? What does identity mean to us as people? And what does identity mean to us as builders? So for purposes of this conversation today, when I say identity, what I mean is an identifier, so an alphanumeric string, set of characters, and then some data about that identifier that goes along with it. So you might think of my identifier as Evan, E-V-I-N, and some data about my identifier might be my location, where I went to school, my Twitter handle, or my public key. So in this way, I'm sure you could think of a lot of different ways that you have identifiers in your life. So for example, you might have a driver's license, and that's got data about you, the date of issuance, your home address, your eye color, which DMV you went to. But let's remember that driver's license isn't a standalone identifier. It's a function of the government. Another kind of identifier that some of us have is a Twitter handle. So mine is @provenauthority on Twitter. And some data about that identifier that helps it become an identity includes my username, my image, my bio, my tweets. And then just to think about, how do these identities express themselves in Web3? I'm sure some of you out there have used Etherscan before to check on your transactions. And so in Etherscan, you can create an account where you've got an Etherscan nickname. And your account, when you log in, it might provide you with some information about yourself. You can obviously review your transaction history. You can also see your account preferences. So In this way, there are a lot of different facets of our lives in meat space and Web 2 and Web 3 where we come across the concept of an identity, where we've got a name and some data that's attributed to that name, whether human readable or otherwise. However, what I want to call out about all these different kinds of identities is that they're each pretty centralized to a single service or owner. So as I said earlier, that driver's license is part of, in my case, the US government and the state of Maine. My Twitter handle means my identity is a function of Twitter. That identity doesn't exist without Twitter. And then similarly with Etherscan, my Etherscan nickname in my account is my identity as a function of that app, and not sort of mine idiosyncratically, atomically existing out here in Web 3. So that's kind of the thing with Web 2, right? Is that identities are often centralized to their platform of use. So if we think about, how does Facebook think about identities? They've got a platform in the middle, centralized platform, centralized authority that's owning, controlling everything that's happening in their ecosystem. And that centralized platform then on the edges, keeps track of a bunch of users. Now, as we are frequently want to do in the Web3 space, we talk about what happens if we remove that central authority and we start to push the ownership, control, and computation of data toward the edges, where we're empowering individual users to be active custodians of their data instead of having that central authority, take ownership of it. But what is happening in that space is that we're not always fully decentralizing our identity so that we still rely on those centralized authorities. But for those of you who might be familiar with the phrase self-sovereign identity, this is the concept that users might be at the center of their own data and be able to collect different types of data about themselves around their identity to create an identifier that's not beholden to any platform, but rather can accrue data from many different platforms, many different places. So just from a logical perspective, we on the Serto team believe strongly that the subject of data should be at the center of that data's use, as opposed to completely outside of the process, which is what we experience with Facebook today, for example. So this is where we get to the title of our conversation for today. Identity silos in Web3 are an unfortunate consequence of the fact that the Ethereum ecosystem specifically doesn't have an identity layer baked into the protocol. Now, for those of you who might be familiar with Near Protocol, Polkadot, other sort of EIPs that went their own way, these protocols have an identity layer that is more baked in, but still not universal, can't transport across chains. So what we're encountering in the Ethereum ecosystem, and actually I think some of you may be sharing this very experience right now, is that at the protocol layer, we have a great amount of freedom. However, if we want to interact with individual Web3 apps, we have to create an identity, so an identifier and some associated data. We have to create an identity that is unique to that app alone. So my username and my identity on Etherscan can tell me about my Ethereum-based activities, but only with respect to Etherscan. My Etherscan identity can't talk to my Nifty Gateway identity, where I've got my username and a history of the fiat-based purchases I may have made with a credit card or art that I may have submitted. So my Nifty Gateway identity can't talk to my Coinbase identity, where my Coinbase wallet has a nickname that I can use to interact with other Coinbase wallets, but that's very centralized to just the Coinbase wallet ecosystem. And those are the Coinbase custodial mobile wallets that I'm referring to specifically. Then when I look to our good friends who've just recently gotten funded and are ready to scale, Gitcoin, their ecosystem is super, super rich and has a lot of different information about me, ways that I've interacted with hackathons, Gitcoin badges, and kudos that I've earned along the way by completing Gitcoin challenges. However, my username, my profile, and some of that interactivity is centralized to Gitcoin. Now, I know Gitcoin is very excited about some of the crypto primitives and decentralized identity elements that we'll talk about in a minute. But for now, my Gitcoin identity can't talk to any of those other facets of my identity, which means that I am beholden to all of these centralized apps for the data about myself, which doesn't feel very decentralized. And then lastly, Audius is a wonderful decentralized music distribution platform that is definitely rooted in the decentralization principles around distribution and rights management. But at the end of the day, artists, creators, and consumers of music on the Audius platform must have a centralized profile that is unique to that application. So perhaps you can see here how the identity systems from each of these different apps means that reputation can't really flow freely through the Ethereum ecosystem if the personal data about your activities is sort of trapped in these different silos. So, what's a Web3 ecosystem to do? And so this conversation has opened up a lot of curiosity around how might we allow user data to travel with the user rather than reside on the app side. And so this would require the creation of an identity, so an identifier and some data about it, that is wholly owned, controlled, self-sovereign, if you will, to that user. So it's a function of the user and their existence atomically and nothing else, as opposed to being a function of and therefore owned and managed by a centralized authority like an app. So forgive me, y'all. I can't see you on the camera here, but I will. I know that Shay will stop me if we end up with any questions. But hopefully this is making sense so far, and I think some of you may be even familiar with some of these experiences managing your own identity in Web3 space. So, as I mentioned, this is an exciting opportunity for us to decentralize that identity layer. So rather than relying on an app-centric identity from any given platform, we can explore what it would look like for the subject of the data to own and control consent around who can see that data, how it can be used, and even how it's stored. So the beautiful thing about self-sovereign identity and reconstructing data around the user is that it can be shared according to the subject's consent. That means they can participate financially in the use of that data in the future. But more importantly, it just means that they're aware of where that data is going in a much more tangible and personal way than, for example, signing off a bunch of terms and conditions and letting the app layer take over. So lastly, a benefit of self-sovereign identity, which we kind of covered, but the ability to move data with its subject rather than have that data storage entrenched in a given application means that your data can be portable. So your identity, the identity and reputation that you cultivate in one space, can be brought over to another space or even another platform or another blockchain. So one example that we're seeing right now is a great desire for end users to be able to bring data about their Web2 credit score from organizations like FICO and transport it into Web3 so they could receive under-collateralized loans from someone like Aave based on their Web2 credit history. Now, in order for that to be possible, that data would need to be pivoted from Web2 to Web3 trustlessly, and that individual, the user, would then need to be able to present that data in a form that was tamper-proof, that a lending protocol like an Aave would be able to trust. And that's where we get into the beauty of cryptographic signatures. So one set of tools that we can rely on from the W3C are decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. So I'm going to ask Shay to drop the link into our chat for the W3C standards for first decentralized identifiers and then verifiable credentials. These are easy references. I know they look kind of dense, but they're actually pretty simple explainers from, as I mentioned, the W3C. Those are the standards body. Those folks decide, how many W's go in www. for websites, that sort of thing. But more recently, that focus has been put on, how do we identify individuals, organizations, assets in a fully decentralized space. So a decentralized identifier can serve the role of that alphanumeric string, that identifier, that name that's part of an identity. And I'll get into why those are so special in a minute. But that decentralized identifier is to iterate on something that Fred Ersham once said about crypto wallets. A decentralized identifier is kind of like a bottomless backpack for data about itself. And that backpack can be filled with verifiable credentials, which are pieces of data that are signed by different parties, but they're about that decentralized identifier. And so the identifier itself can choose, which pieces of data that they want to share in what context. So a decentralized—
Evan, real quick, thank you.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. for your slides, and this is something on your side, I think it needs access. Can you just open that up for view for everybody on your slides when you have a chance?
Oh yeah,
Just,
absolutely.
I
Here,
shared the
hang on,
slides, so yeah.
let me just hop out
She'll
and do
let you
that
have
right
access to
now.
those by the end for sure. All right, thank you.
All right, you got it. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Shay. All right, so next up, we've got decentralized identifiers, or the identity that belongs to you. So as I mentioned, this W3C standard is a way to identify a person, a group, an organization, a thing, a cat, a car, to basically just with a unique set of, or a unique name, that identifier, and it comes with a set of keys. So in the same way that an Ethereum address includes a set of keys that leverages public-private key cryptography and allows you to sign messages to prove your ownership of that address, so too do decentralized identifiers. Now, the very cool thing about decentralized identifier methods is that there's a universal resolver, which allows for different DID methods to be created for many different use cases. So there are more than 90 different kinds of DID methods, basically ways to create this universal identifier that can all be universally interpreted. So some examples of those DID methods include DIDs for Ethereum addresses, where you just put your Ethereum public key in the namespace of the DID method, and then it becomes a bottomless backpack of data about itself. There are also DID methods for different blockchains, such as Sovereign or Bitcoin, I believe. There are also DID methods. Actually, the 3Box team just introduced a DID method for NFTs. So NFTs can now hold an infinite amount of cross-chain data about themselves, their source, what they've interacted with, their exhibition history, things like that. And additionally, the Gnosis team has released DID Safe, and that method allows for any one of the multi-sig participants to sign on behalf of a DID, basically converts a multi-sig wallet contract into a DID. Or additionally, you could choose, if you wanted to add another layer, to require all of the participants in a multi-sig wallet to sign on behalf of a DID for that signature to be valid. So this just gives us an increased level of complexity and capabilities for these identifiers. Lastly, the beauty of these decentralized identifiers is, as I've mentioned, that they can be the subject of a verifiable credential. So that, let's say, you find a credential that's written about a certain subject or a person, that credential could be found on a flash drive on top of Mount Everest 100 years from now, and you'd be able to still figure out, what it's saying, who it's about, who it's from, even if you don't have the rest of that context. So the nice thing about decentralized identifiers also is that they're not necessarily on-chain. They're a fully off-chain atomic way to identify oneself, identify a party. There are certain kinds of decentralized identifiers that use hashed data on chain to basically manage the public nature of what parts of that identity can be found. However, the beauty of DIDs is that it offers the control to choose whether you want your identity to be on chain or not. So sometimes people will ask me, what's the difference between ENS and a DID? And so one way to think about it is ENS is on-chain always. DIDs are on-chain only if you want them to be. ENS is essentially a redirect to other pieces of data, other wallets, but doesn't have its own set of keys. A decentralized identifier does indeed have its own set of keys. So there actually is also a DID method, DID ENS, that allows you to use your ENS address as an identifier. We've also reached out to the ENS team to suggest that one of the fields in an ENS address might be your desired DID. So there's still a lot of evolution working there, but I would consider DIDs to be the basis of off-chain scalable data, whereas ENS is more about on-chain data that is scalable depending on your appetite for paying gas prices. And then our companion to decentralized identifiers are verifiable credentials. So these are, as I mentioned, also a W3C standard. Verifiable credentials are tamper-evident, cryptographically verified credentials that are authored written by one party about another party. So it's basically a verifiable claim that describes a certain trait or an event as attested by one party about another. So some examples might include ConsenSys can issue a verifiable credential to Shay, saying that Shay works at ConsenSys. Yale University could issue a verifiable credential to me, saying that Evan McMullen graduated and here's her transcript. And actually, that very example is what we're working on with the University of Colorado cybersecurity program, so that their students will be able to receive their transcripts and academic accomplishments in the form of these verifiable credentials. Your verifiable credentials might also constitute information about your actions. So for example, your credit score or proof that you have listened to 9,000 hours of the band Fish on Spotify, proof of fandom of a museum, kind of like a proof of different traits about yourself that you might want to share with others. So one of the really awesome things about verifiable credentials is that they are off-chain. They do not require any gas fees. And so you can issue as many as you want, and you don't necessarily need to invoke any concerns around scaling or gas fees, depending on what the price of Ethereum is at any given time. And so VCs, verifiable credentials, can be issued in an open-ended state, but they can also be set to expire, and they can also be revoked. Now, revoking credentials requires, of course, a little bit of consensus to make sure that everyone is maintaining the state of those credentials, but there are some ways around it that we can get back to later, or you guys can reach out to me if you have specific questions about that. So when you send a verifiable credential to someone else, they can receive it, and it's their choice whether they want to show others that credential. They can decide that they want to keep it private, which is something you might want to do, for example, for the results of an STD test. Or you can decide that you want to disclose it to another party. For example, you might want to disclose your employment status to a potential landlord who's trying to rent you a home. And you can decide, that you want to disclose it for a certain period of time, and then to revoke that permission to access. So you can both revoke the credential itself, and you can revoke, as a user, you can, or the subject of the credential, you can revoke access to it by others. So it gives us many different layers of consent around this data in a Web3 world where we often talk about immutable data. Having mutable data is really helpful for us to provide context. And also, because the subject of a verifiable credential is determined upon its issuance. So for example, let's say in the view that we have here, I've issued a Future of Work group member credential to Sean Chang, who is part of the Future of Work working group. Because of that, this credential is, cryptographically describes the fact that Sean is part of this team. And so if someone else were to present this credential, it would be like, they were showing Sean's driver's license. It's not going to do a whole lot for that other person because they are not the subject of the credential, and the credential is non-transferable. So in this way, you'll hear a lot about verifiable credentials being excellent tickets for events. Actually, at ETH Denver a few years ago, the Uport team used exactly this technology to do free off-chain cryptographically secure tickets for the event. They're superior to NFTs for things like tickets because they don't involve gas fees, they can't be scalped, there isn't a secondary market, and they're non-transferable. And so this is also a really interesting way to look at things like being able to access early e-commerce or retail experiences online. There are certain things you can do to earn a VC that only a human can do. And so this anti-Sybil protection allows us to assign verifiable credentials essentially as proof of human to parties based on their activities, and therefore to circumvent the bot ecosystem altogether. So Joe Lubin, our fearless leader, is certainly an enthusiast of decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. And indeed, last winter, around December, wrote a document called the Mesh XYZ DID Directory Network, which is a vision that he had described to easily enable people, organizations to start establishing, creating their own decentralized identifiers. So we on the Serto team very much shared that vision. We're very excited about it. And so we set to work. Specifically today, I'll talk about some examples where we started with the mesh. So in this sort of call to arms, Joe had encouraged us to explore how we might issue verifiable credentials to the portfolio investments of Tachyon and Coven and even mesh investments. And so we've already set up the infrastructure to be able to do that. And I'll share that with you in a moment. So the first thing that we're going to do actually, I'll pause for a quick second. Shay, do we have any questions or anything that we want to cover off before I hop into our next stage?
No questions queued as of yet. So yeah, all this content is great. I love it. I love the fact that it's going for this, the human factor. How do we validate? How do we verify that you're actually human? So this is great. I think this is something that was something to solve, especially when people were, the identity thing in general. There's a lot of like holes in the wall that people are wondering how are we looking to solve it. So it looks like this is it. If anybody is interested in queuing up any questions, the other thing is if you add a question here and someone else also has that same question, we can upvote that so that Evan knows that that's an important question to address. So yeah, carry on, Evan. This is great. And I'll let you know as soon as one pops into the queue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shay. So what we're going to do here together first is we're going to practice creating a verifiable credential together. And so credentials, as we know, it's just a statement that one party makes about another statement. So first, we can just take a look at the different kinds of verifiable credentials that our team has created this week. So we've got some examples of the kinds of credentials that you might receive. An organization might receive a credential from Tachyon when they get an investment, and they could show that credential to others to prove that they indeed have received funding from Tachyon. You all may remember in 2017 during the ICO craze, just about every project had a picture of Vitalik as an advisor at the bottom of their screen, but very few had an actual way to interrogate that relationship, to tell more about it. So that's one example of the ways that enterprise-to-enterprise verifiable credentials can be helpful in the investment space. As we mentioned in sort of the proof of human, there are a lot of ways that we as human beings overshare our data, kind of leak our personal data into the world. So this is kind of a silly example, but every time you go to a bar or an establishment that is age-gated and you present your driver's license or government ID, that bouncer does not need to know your eye color. They don't need to know how tall you are. They just need to know whether or not you're over the appropriate age of entry. So in this way, verifiable credentials can just offer information about whether or not you fit a certain criteria and not necessarily all of the plain text about your data. So additionally, there are verifiable credentials that have been created by the W3C for COVID-19 vaccines. So you can carry around one of those credentials. We're actually seeing in the state of New York, IBM has used decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials to do just that, to create the Excelsior Pass, which is a digital, basically digital proof of vaccine. However, unfortunately, IBM chose to bypass all 90 plus available DID methods and to create their own that cannot be interpreted by anyone else. So they've sort of created their own silo in that way, using this more, I think, as innovation theater than anything else. So lastly, we see there's a bunch of different kinds of employment credentials here, but just to show you all how easy it is to make your own credential, we can make one right here today. So I am going to create a credential for, let's say, Shay, can you help me think of an example? I should have had one off the top of my head, but now I'm blanking out. What's a kind of credential that would be helpful to give to members of our community?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, it could be something like, for example, in our Discord community, you could give a special access to our ambassadors.
All right. So let's say this is an investor access credential. And this credential attests that the subject of the credential is allowed to communicate.
And actually it's ambassador, but investors cool too. I was like, ooh, investors.
All right, ambassador, sorry about that.
Perfect.
Ambassador
That's
access.
okay.
So let's say this credential attests that the subject is allowed to communicate in exclusive ambassador conversations.
Nice.
And other ambassador specific channels.
Access to channels, yeah.
Great. And those channels could be Discord channels. Those channels could be, newsletters in the future, or they could present this ambassador credential at a future ConsenSys party to show that they're part of the community, and we'd let them in right away. So this is the nice thing about verifiable credentials is it allows you to get access to data that you don't own without an API integration. So you can check whether or not a verifiable credential is legit without having to ask the person who issued it, which is really nice. So for this credential, we'll say we want the credential subject's DID, so the decentralized identifier of the subject. Not everybody has one, so we'll make this optional. But let's say some of our ambassadors are particularly forward-thinking and they've already got DID set up. And then we'll also ask for their human-readable name. So we'll just ask them to write their name and we'll require that.
You're saying the DID is optional? Because is that something that's like a unique identifier, but is that required or it's an optional thing?
That is a great question, Shay. So DIDs and VCs work together beautifully, but they don't require each other. So a verifiable credential is just a cryptographically signed attestation that the person writing it, is willing to cryptographically sign this piece of information that they're saying is important, or that they're putting forth. Now, that piece of information, what they're attesting, it can be about another identifier, and that's sort of the most powerful, is when you have two identifiers giving information about each other. But you can also make that credential describe anything. It could describe a person who doesn't have an identifier, but maybe has another way to identify themselves. So for example, let's say if one of the ambassadors in our network who we're reaching out to with this opportunity, they don't have a decentralized identifier, but they're going to carry around their driver's license, and the ConsenSys, door guy decides, or girl decides that they want to, they see the name on the credential, they look at the driver's license, they say, okay, I guess this is fine. But again, that's what requiring some centralized trust in that party to seek out additional context about the identity. So the nice thing is that when we use decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials together, we don't have to trust any other data outside of that ecosystem. However, if we're doing verifiable credentials that are just about parties without decentralized identifiers, then we need some other way to identify them. But great question. So as you'll see, this is our, ambassador access pass. We'll be fun, and we can put in there we go. So it's pretty simple here. You can see, we can view it in different forms based on the different kinds of schemas that we're trying to look at. And then it's as simple as clicking publish to create this verifiable credential, and voila, we have just made a verifiable credential for ambassador access together. So if I wanted to issue this credential to Shay, I would run over to Serto Agent. And Shay, I'm going to ask you if you could share the Serto Agent Amazon Web Services Marketplace link in the chat. This is where you can get your own Serto Agent if you have an AWS instance. This is a self-hosted agent where we keep the keys in our Amazon KMS. So this is not a centralized service from Serto. This is wholly self-hosted standalone, or AWS hosted, but self-run, self-operated as standalone. And so what Serto Agent allows me to do is to easily create a decentralized identifier, to share that decentralized identifier with others. So, create it basically a name for myself and show other people what that is so that they can interact with it. But it also allows me to very easily issue, request, disclose, revoke, and interrogate the credentials that I find in the wild. So this is kind of like a desktop version of the old Uport app, if you remember that. The Uport app was built before there were common standards that we all agreed on for DIDs and VCs. And so it's a bit out of date, but this is essentially performing a lot of those similar functions with the updated standards. So actually, just really quick, I'm going to hop out of order a little here for a second, just to show you guys how easy it is to create a decentralized identifier with the associated keys. We're going to go ahead and create one together now. So I'm going to create a DID. Let's say this is going to be for the ConsenSys Ambassador Program. And so in the future, any verifiable credential that is signed by this identifier will show that the ConsenSys Ambassador Program issued that credential. So it's just as easy as clicking Create DID. And there we go. We have a new decentralized identifier in place, which I think is being covered by my little Crowdcast thing at the bottom. But basically, you all saw just how easy it was to create that identifier. And so now, because we've created it, we want to make it publicly visible. We want other people to be able to try to find it. So one of the very popular ways that we recommend to make that identifier public, especially for enterprises, is to expose it in the DNS record. So by using DNS, by using their existing website, you can just put a little piece of code in there that includes our did and did document. So actually we can download that pretty easy, or we can create that pretty easily. So let's say we want to use our most recently created did, that ConsenSys ambassador one. Let's pretend for just a minute that we already have a website in place. So let's say ConsenSys ambassador.com. And what this function will do is create basically a technical document, just a text file that is a verifiable credential that says ConsenSys ambassadors did attests that ConsenSysambassador.com is indeed our website and that it is related to our identifier. It's sort of a similar process to if I had a coffee shop and I wrote down my decentralized identifier on a card and I placed it in the window for all to see. In the same way, we're going to be putting that decentralized identifier in the DNS record for all to query. So we're going to generate that did config file. And I think I just have to do it twice here. Sorry, there's a little bug. There we go. And then I would just download that file locally, just like I would any other. And then I can drag and drop that, upload it into FTP or whatever tool I'm using to manage my website source files. So then that's discoverable, pretty simple and easy. But to get back to our credentials, let's say I wanted to issue that credential that we just built, our ambassador access credential. I wanted to issue it to someone. So let's say I'm going to issue one to Shay. Shay does not have a decentralized identifier, so I'm going to leave that blank, but she does have a name. So I am going to include it there. I'm going to make this a revocable credential, so that in the future, if we want it to revoke, we can. And then I'll keep a copy locally so I can keep track of the fact that I've issued one to Shay. So it's as simple as clicking issue credential. And now this credential says that Shay is granted ambassador access. And if we wanted to learn more about that credential, we could copy its contents and we could visit Serto Search, which is a cross-chain search engine that allows users to find out more information about decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, and even NFTs that they find in the wild. So if we wanted to validate that verifiable credential that we just created, we could explore it and see that it was issued by my instance of Serto here. The subject is Shay, and the schema is the ambassador access schema that, that we created over here. So as you can see, with these simple tools provided by Serto, it's a lot quicker than having to write code every time that you want to issue a credential. So a lot of people ask, why is it that verifiable credentials aren't as popular right now, or decentralized identifiers haven't been adopted as widely? And part of that reason is that until now, there really wasn't a simple, easy way to be able to interact with all of this stuff. However, the current market, Serto included, is definitely working toward that UX layer of easing the complexity of use for businesses and for individuals as well. And I will note that there is a staggering number of enterprises that have DID and VC-based identity technology just beneath the surface that is not yet public. So from SAP to our friends over at the Graph Protocol, the expanse of Web2 and Web3 organizations looking to use DIDs and VCs as the backbone of identity for their users and for their enterprises, I think is an indication of growth to come. And so if we hop back to our slide presentation here, I wanted to talk quickly through a few examples of how you could use a decentralized identifier and verifiable credential ecosystem to achieve some cool goals. And perhaps this will spark some inspiration for the upcoming hackathon. So as I mentioned earlier, a university such as Yale University, where I went, or University of Colorado, where we're working with, can issue verifiable credentials to students that attest to their graduation, their transcript, or even, some smaller academic achievements. So for example, Yale University might issue a verifiable credential about Alice that says, this is Alice's diploma. And so Alice might be able to share that verifiable credential with ConsenSys when she applies for a job. And then ConsenSys won't have to go back to Yale to ask whether or not Alice graduated, which is what is required today and is actually the process that Microsoft uses internally, that they manually go and ask the universities as opposed to using a credential system, or at least for some of their capabilities. In a little closer to home, we could imagine that Tachyon, our startup accelerator, could issue a graduate credential to its portfolio companies that have completed the Tachyon program, such as Idle Finance. And so Idle Finance might be able to take their verifiable credential and present it to someone like Infura to request preferential, let's say, billing rates for Infura Gas because they're part of the ConsenSys family and the Tachyon family. As I mentioned earlier, New York State's Excelsior Pass issues credentials to users that attest to their COVID-19 vaccination. And then those users are able to present that attested credential to airports and airlines to prove that they have indeed, or even bars to prove that they have indeed received the vaccine. So we can attest to employment, and those employees can take their employment credential and prove that they work somewhere. So for example, at DevCon, might entertain credentials from ConsenSys to prove that you are qualified to participate in the hackathon. As I mentioned, I think before, we were talking about credit scores. So FICO is very excited about the decentralized identifier space and exploring how that could be used to make user data more mobile and more portable. And so you could conceivably share a verifiable credential about your credit worthiness to receive an under collateralized loan. You could also, in the music space, depending on the kinds of activities you do, let's say listening to music or attending shows, you could get a verifiable credential that attests that you are a fan of a certain artist. And then let's say you go to a music shop and they check out your credentials and see that you're a fan of a band that they like also, and they could offer you a discount, or they could offer you special access to content that's related to that credential.
It's like a VIP pass, yeah?
Exactly. So that's a really wonderful example. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Shay. Actually, we are exploring what that looks like. How can a verifiable credential grant you access to special privileges in physical space? So for example, verifiable credentials can be presented as a QR code. That QR code can be scanned to open a door. Similarly, that QR code or that verifiable credential can be presented to access gated digital content. So verifiable credentials can allow you to control access to both online and offline and physical experiences. But this is all off-chain, all free, all cryptographically secure and tamper-proof. So I know a lot of times we get excited talking about NFTs because it's a very familiar crypto primitive that I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time playing with, personally and professionally. But I think it's sometimes useful for us to compare and contrast the difference between verifiable credentials and NFTs. So VCs are off-chain. That means that they don't require any gas. That means that they are private. Whereas NFTs, as we know, are on-chain. Their issuance is immutably documented for all to see, and their existence is public. And so verifiable credentials, in contrast to that immutability, can be revocable or made to expire. So in that way, they're mutable data versus the NFT's immutable data of its existence. So verifiable credentials can be selectively disclosed or shared with only certain people for a limited time or forever. NFTs are public, and so therefore you don't really have a lot of discretion over who the information is shared with. However, the custody of that NFT obviously can only belong to either a person or multi-sig wallet. But that ownership is visible to all. Now, usually NFTs are transferable. Obviously, in the case of non-transferable 1155s, we do have that exception, but that's kind of an edge case. And the fact that NFTs are transferable makes them a bad use case for tickets, because then you can't, or VIP passes, guest lists, anything that requires that permission be related to the person. So for example, if I issued a VIP or a VIP access badge or a backstage pass to Shay, I wouldn't want Shay selling it to her friend, because then her random friend's showing it backstage and we were expecting Shay. So that would be an example where an NFT, because it's transferable, is only useful when it doesn't really matter who's holding it. But a verifiable credential is a wonderful use case for more privileged access, like VIP passes, backstage passes, tickets, etc., because those non-transferable assets mean that they can't be remonetized. There isn't a secondary market, and it's Sybil protected.
Evan, sorry to interject. I was going to say, I'm really happy you made this distinction, and in this particular use case, this is a great way to like help us understand, because it's like you said, it's not everything is appropriate for every kind of need, right? And especially the big craze around NFTs, I think people are still trying to figure out. But I feel like, the worry about NFTs tends to be around these things, like around identity or exclusivity, and which is actually probably what artists, when they're considering this stuff, they want to offer that really legit, exclusive experience that can't just be like, replicated easily. So I think actually it's like NFTs are this like, it's almost like when you offer some kind of, something you normally like a vinyl record or whatever. And so maybe you offer them something that is another fan exclusive that is not so much about access. It's more about like a collectible. And then you have the VC stuff where it's that this is about access. This is about like, okay, you're this type of fan, you're the super fan. So this is like the access to all these different things. And you have like something that is like, you've earned it and it's exclusive. So I love this distinction. Thank you.
Shay, yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that you condensed it very beautifully. NFTs are objects. Verifiable credentials are access. And NFTs are sort of self-contained, or can be, whereas verifiable credentials are necessarily a function of their subject. They say something about their subject, whereas an NFT is kind of a standalone asset. But you bring up a really great point that NFTs do not have an identity layer. They're just, a digitally unique asset that is created out of a contract. And so what that means is that, for example, when Beeple sold that $69 million piece at Christie's, there is nothing at the protocol layer that includes Beeple's identity, that includes Christie's identity. It's sort of like if you go all the way down to the protocol with that asset, it just says Maker's Place. Mm-hmm. Like it has Maker's Place, Maker's Place's address. So actually that's a conversation I had with Christie's the other day, is that you are not empowering your artists to assert their authorship at the protocol level. And therefore Beeple relies on the centralized authority of Maker's Place to relate his authorship of that work. So it is up to Maker's Place's discretion to subjectively furnish this information. Of course they will, because it's in their economic interest. But we have
it's dependent on that chain. It's dependent on that.
We have eliminated the trustlessness there. We now have a centralized trust and a centralized authority that stands between Beeple and the authorship or claim to his artworks. And because he is creating works on different chains, on different layers, there is no data that unites the NFT artworks of Beeple or any other artist that has worked on multiple platforms.
That's yeah. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. And I'm glad that you're pointing that, because again, there's lots of controversy around NFTs and understanding like what is it and what are you really getting? And when you that's a lot of money investing into these things. And before people kind of full-fledged go forward, like I'm going to create NFTs and become a millionaire. But also just like, I think mostly from an artist standpoint, people want to figure out new ways to engage their fans. And so it's just understanding the context and the use case is important, because it's not a one-stop shop, so it's like, right. We do have a question that came in from Shane. Has anyone proposed a token standard which encodes a VC into something like an NFT, which could allow someone to optionally add on-chain features to a VC?
Oh, Shane, that is a beautiful question. I love it. And it makes me think of two different technology approaches. One is, how do we take an NFT and wrap it in with VCs? And the other is, how do we take a VC and incorporate or use it to incite on-chain actions as you had just described. And so for the former, the 3Box team has created the NFT DID method. And so what that allows you to do is take any NFT, even ones before the standards like CryptoPunks, to wrap it in a decentralized identifier, basically give the NFT its own backpack. And then the NFT has the ability to receive, be the subject of, hang on to an infinite number of verifiable credentials about itself. So just the other day, I was actually chatting with some artist friends about how we can use this method, and we can use verifiable credentials to create exhibition histories for NFTs, to allow the artist or creator to append as much metadata as they want to that NFT about how, what works did I, what work might this be derivative of? What inspiration did I have? What materials did I use? What time did I create it? What computer did I make it on? What music was I listening to when I created this piece?
Oh, that's great.
Any information that you want, any information you can imagine can be issued in the form of a verifiable credential and then just added to that set of data about the NFT. Now, if you're wondering, how is it that an NFT can travel from, or an identity can travel from chain to chain, from platform to platform, and app to app, and still be able to access all this information about itself? And that's where our friends over at 3Box come in. Their ceramic storage platform, which I believe is in private beta right now, allows for verifiable credentials and other metadata to be accessed from L1, L2, any chain, anytime.
Oh, nice.
And so that's pretty cool. Now, one thing I want to call out about the sort of NFT kind of on-chain stuff here is, so a former member of the Uport team, I believe it was Pele, proposed, I think it's like EIP 721 that allows verifiable credentials to incite on-chain action. So you present a VC and you can sort of trigger a contract to respond accordingly. So hopefully that kind of gets at the other side of Shane's question, but I'd be happy to provide documentation supporting both.
That's an amazing, Evan and Shane. Great question. Yeah, I actually had the same thing. And to know that there's a solution like this, I think, Evan, this is seriously I think this could be the thing. Like you're basically saying an NFT is wrapped in a VC kind of
NFT, or rather,
it's
NFT,
in its little backpack.
Yeah, exactly. An NFT can be wrapped in a DID. So an NFT gets its own identity. And that identity comes with a set of keys. So imagine an NFT could tweet if you wanted. So the way that the NFT DID method works is that you delegate all of the capabilities of a DID. So like the ability to sign with the keys and manage the credentials, you just delegate that to the party who's holding the NFT. So the person who's custody, or the party who has custody of the NFT, can kind of, play it like a marionette or like a puppet, if you will. And so one really important thing about NFTs having their own basically way to store data that's specific to the NFT and not to an NFT platform is that, as we discussed, the centralized silos, here, let me hop back here for a second till we get our graphic. The centralized silos pertain to NFTs too. So the visual art, the name, the description, the human readable name of the author, all of that data is centralized to an NFT platform and can't flow from one to another. So additionally, for example, OpenSea, where a lot of us may have encountered NFTs before, if you have a special contract on OpenSea where you as the artist would like to receive a split of future sales of that NFT, that means that you have to resell the NFT on OpenSea. If you take that NFT off platform, its metadata, its traits, its contracts can't go with it. And that is unnecessarily restrictive. That creates silos in our ecosystem. So an NFT that has resale privileges and benefits for an artist that's resold on OpenSea, if you resell that on a different platform, you disenfranchise that artist and you basically remove their the relationship that they have with that work. But we firmly believe on the Serto team that creators should have an indelible, immutable relationship with the assets that they create. And so instead of relying on the Ethereum protocol to manage authorship, we think that a little bit more of an active role for creators of any assets, whether they're smart contracts, NFTs, verifiable credentials, or otherwise, those parties should have the ability to control, how their authorship is expressed, and not necessarily have to rely on or request assistance from another party to say that one of their works is indeed one of their works.
Oh, I mean, it's amazing. And honestly, I feel like this is the missing link right now. I mean, seriously, this is because I'm an artist as well. And I've always been kind of trying to wrap my brain around like this piece, which I think that if you just have it where that the NFT you can actually give it exclusivity. You can actually give it something where you're giving that confidence to the person who's getting it, because that's part of the excitement, is that it's a limited edition or exclusive, right? It's like if you actually buy a physical piece, you have it, because everybody's like, well, what's the difference if it's just like copied over here, and how is that so unique? And then also to the creators, it's like, we have these PROs like ASCAP and BMI to track like our stuff, but if it was like this, knowing that it doesn't matter if it's shared, you actually get the credit. It doesn't matter how it's done. You don't have to keep your policing, how your art is used or remixed. And so I think this is amazing. So thank you so much for going through that.
Thank you, Shay. Well, and I know we're coming up on time here, but just a few things I wanted to call out, and specific to your example in music that we can definitely discuss later. As you note, basically the existing ecosystem requires that artists proactively seek out and defend the use of their works. But instead, if those works were able to defend themselves and to report on where they're being used and where they're being expressed, this gives a lot greater autonomy to this ecosystem and doesn't necessarily require on individuals to report the retroactive use of things in the same way. And so just really quickly here at the end, to give a quick refresher to everyone on the Serto team, what we're up to and how we roll. Our focus is on bringing the ease of use to decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. I can't write code very well, and I feel like there are probably some others out there who either would prefer some buttons sometimes, or have much more opportunities if these tools are easy. And so that's our goal, is to empower as many people as possible to unlock the value of decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. So if you're curious about what does product design mean in this space, that's product UX: simplicity of use, clarity, and ease. And so we are very inspired by the call to arms from Joe to create an ecosystem that is predicated on decentralized identifiers, but uses a cross-chain search engine to open up freedom of information for all, not just those in the Ethereum ecosystem, not just those working at ConsenSys. So we've got, actually, here, I'll show you real quick. We have a number of organizations in the ConsenSys family that are already set up and ready to go with their decentralized identifiers. They can issue credentials right away. So if you are interested in adding your team or your website to Serto Search, all you have to do is get set up with the DID and then just add your domain here, something like that. And then you're off to the races. So in conclusion,
and this is the link we put in the chat as well. You're looking at that. So there's a link there for Serto Search, as well as the Serto schemas that she went over, right? Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Shay. Yeah, sorry, I think I forgot to ask you to add those in there, but those are all freely available. And then additionally, as I mentioned, Serto Agent is in the AWS Marketplace. If you need some help getting that set up, we've got some great documentation. Be happy to share that as well. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me at any time on Twitter, email, Slack. Thank you all so much for attending this conversation. We're really inspired and excited to see what people build in the hackathon. We'll certainly be joining some of you all. And if your teams are curious about developing a decentralized identity layer for your project, so you're not re-centralizing your users' experiences, we are here to help. So Shay, thank you so much for having us here today. And
yeah, absolutely.
That's it for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Evan. This has been really, really insightful. And as well, I love that you had a call for the hackathon itself. If anybody is interested in you're saying we'd like to improve or have some more UX UI love into what Serto is doing. Okay. So if anybody's inspired by today's workshop, please reach out to Evan with any additional questions on Slack. Of course, that's the easiest. And then make sure you're in our ConsenSys Hackathon 2021 Slack channel. That's where we're going to be posting all the replays of all these workshops, including this one. And by the way, it's always going to be the exact same link that you're watching it now is going to be the replays available. We also have these multi-streaming to our YouTube channel playlist and will be available down the line as well. But those are immediately available. Also, the slide deck, we'll post those again. And if you want to have any conversation more about ideas around what can you do for the hackathon, please sign up. There's a sign up form, and we'll connect you and make sure that you have the team. And then also, I'm sure if you want to pick Evan's brain a little bit more, I'm sure she'll help guide you with that as well. Because any of these innovations, we're so excited to see what you guys come up with. It's a burst of 5 days, and of course we're working with I'm sure everybody's super busy and has crazy bandwidth, but this is the time to get those ideas some legs, because we have some great brains that are willing to kind of jump in and help hack something out within that time frame. And there are some great rewards and prizes in it too as well. So yeah, and the final thing is, in terms of the, let me see, the last takeaway is, I think we did already share the slides. Okay, so yes, thank you again, Evan. And if there's anything else you want to offer as a takeaway, post that on Slack in the ConsenSys Hackathon 2020 channel. And I hope everybody had a wonderful experience here today, and we hope to see you on the next one. So thank you again, Evan.
Thank you, Shay.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.